Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final installment of this year's Pride series. My name is M. Shadi Malaklu, and I'm the chair of Women's and Gender Studies at Berea College and the director of its Women's and Gender Non-Conforming Center. Thank you for joining us today for a virtual conversation with LGBTQPIA+ activist artists Z. Zane McNeil and Gray Armstrong. Zane's co-edited collection, Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression, was recently released by Sanctuary Publishers, and their second anthology, Y'all Means All, The Emerging Voices of Queering Appalachia, is forthcoming from PM Press. Gray is a writer and instructor of Black culture, history, and dance. His work, which focuses on unconscious bias and cross-cultural communication, is available on his website, Obsidian Tea. Together, Zane and Gray write about and explore dialogic and relational forms of expression. They are particularly interested in the choreopolitics of protest, or in the aesthetic components of bodies sharing the same protest space. Today's workshop will introduce us to this concept and to other non-object-based art theories. It will help us begin to imagine how we can create our own embodied art and engage in activist cultures, for example, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement during the current socio-political climate of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are so thrilled to welcome Zane and Gray to this virtual conversation and to think with them about how we can participate in the aesthetics of protest in new and creative ways. Before we begin, I'd like to remind the audience that they are welcome to submit questions throughout, either through the chat function or the Q&A function, both of which can be found on your Zoom dashboard below. We will answer your questions at the end. I would also like to remind everyone that our next series, Art is Activism, Making Black and Brown Queer Lives Matter, includes two events on Thursday, November 12th. A gender talk with Che Gossett about Black trans art and abolition enchantment, and a convocation with founder of the Undocu-Queer movement, Julio Salgado. Both of these events will also think about the role that aesthetics and art play in how we make political demands for freedom. The Zoom information for those events are listed on our Facebook page, Women's and Gender Studies at Berea College. You can also view recordings of the Pride events that you miss on our website, www.berea.edu/WGS/Pride. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Zane and Gray.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gray Armstrong, and I'm going to take a second to share my screen so I can bring up our PowerPoint that we have for you all. Great. So we're going to, sorry about that. We're going to be talking about embodied art and the aesthetics of protest today. And I wanted to really start off with kind of a personal story, and then we're going to kind of look at that personal story and start seeing the conversations that are happening between bodies in this moment that I'm going to recall. For this moment, it may be, what word do I want to use here? It may be triggering for some in terms of bringing up some feelings and things. So if that is something that happens to you, please take care of yourself. So I am a Black trans man who lives in Northern Alabama at the moment. And I'm a new driver. I've been driving for about 2 years. And as the pandemic started, I wasn't leaving the house much. And I decided one night that I really wanted to go grab something to eat. I was tired of cooking and I just needed to get out and like run to the store and then come back. And it was pretty late at night. And as I'm driving back, I see lights in my mirrors. And in this moment, I become very frightened and very worried about my safety. And I pull over. And I have a panic disorder. So I've been practicing for for the whole time I've been driving to be able to tell the officer that I have a panic disorder, to let them know that ahead of time, that way my behavior can be seen through that lens. He shines the light in my eyes. And in that moment, I'm transported back in time to various conversations that I'd had with my mother about how I'm supposed to behave in public. And I'm also simultaneously feeling a lot of weight and awareness about being a trans body in this time period. And I'm able to tell him, hey, I have a panic disorder. And luckily, he was very kind and very sweet to me as far as these interactions can go, and told me my tail light was out, and I got out of the car and checked it. And he lets me go with a warning. And I drive the 2 minutes to my house, and I have a breakdown for about 3 weeks. And in this breakdown, I started to heal a bit, and I was like, you know what? I'm okay. You know, I'm a Black adult. I know how this goes. I know these power dynamics. Like, it's fine. And I had decided that I was going to call a friend of mine. I'd set up the phone call a few days prior, but as it came to the time to call him, I thought, I don't know that I need this. Like, it's fine. But I call him anyway. And he's an older Black man in my life who's kind of taken on a role of uncle because I have some family issues. So I don't have a great support system, as you can imagine. And I call him up and we start talking, and it's great. And he asked me why I asked to call him. And I said, oh, I got pulled over. And I can't quite remember exactly what his reaction was, but it caused me to sob hysterically for about an hour and a half. And it was the first time I cried after this incident. And we talked, and I felt like in a lot of ways, our relationship was him caring for me in a way that I was not prepared for. And additionally, there was a lot of shame for me around, I felt like I should have known how to act during that moment. I knew what my role was, but I wasn't able to do it in the moment. And he reminded me, as a trans guy with a tough family life, that I was not given the rule book that most Black men are given for that encounter. In that, with my youth on top of my transness, which is also sends you back to the feelings of puberty a lot of the time, is like this: you are reacting like a 17-year-old would react in this moment, and so you should be kind to yourself as this happens. And we hung up the phone, and I thought for a few weeks about it. And during that time, I started really reflecting on what was so upsetting about this moment, what was happening to me, and what it all meant. And what it made me realize as I slowly crawled out of this depression and out of this terror was that this conversation that the officer and I had non-verbally was much bigger than us. And not only was it much bigger than us, but we had roles to play in terms of how our bodies existed in space, what choices we made with them, and how we interacted with each other. And by not playing the roles, I created certain dangers for myself, in addition to the amount of power differential that happens because of that difference. This incident and my recovery from it happened about 3 weeks before the Black Lives Matter protests really started back up again in COVID-19. And like my introduction said, I'm a writer primarily. And so I looked and I was like, I need to participate in this movement, but I am afraid of driving. And I can't wear a mask because I have PTSD. So, because this was very early in the pandemic, and I've since then been able to, but like at the time, it was an impossible task. And so I started to question and wonder what is it to be able to be a body in this protest, even if it's through online medias? And how does that show up? And what does that look like? And what symbolism are we using to be a part of this movement? And so, as we move towards the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, I kind of wanted to talk briefly about the fact that this movement is very, very different from the civil rights movement of the past in terms of a lot of the choices that are made, in terms of who's front and center and who's celebrated, and a lot of other things. And so I love this quote that I found that will come up next. So we're going to be talking about choreopolitics, which is this idea that your body can be an avenue for discussion around political moments and activism, and that these interactions that we have are not just um, like social moments, but they can be art, they can be protests, they can be symbolic for certain ideas and concepts that we want to be able to carry into other parts of life. And in and of themselves can be a form of protest that is not necessarily just shouting or things of that nature. There are many different ways to participate. I love this quote. This ain't your grandparents' civil rights movement. And I feel like in a lot of ways, I really started to feel that right as the moment started up again, of that this felt different. This felt personal. And this feels um, as though there is a great variety of participation from a lot of different places. And one of the easiest places that you can start to see um, that this is a different type of movement, and that there are these little things that are done throughout the movement that really matter, uh, is in this photo. These are the three women who created Black Lives Matter as a concept and have been really organizing that. But when we think of, say, the civil rights movement, we think about Black men typically, even though there were tons of Black women who were heavily participating. And so, even just looking at this image of seeing these Black women being the powerful people that are in charge of this movement, and the fact that they are also centering Black queerness as one of the primary aspects of this movement, is the start of realizing that our language with our bodies and with our representation for this movement is so different than some of the previous movements. So as it started to happen, I started to decide to write. And as I was writing, I realized that there were a lot of different images coming about and being shared and being talked about. And I started to think about those as different ways of sharing um, the participation of the action of being in the protest, even if you weren't necessarily at the protest yourself. And it became this curious idea of, is there a way to participate in these protests through online medias by showcasing certain bodies and certain movements and ideas that can then create discussion about the thing in and of itself. So some current acts that I've seen through digital media that have shown up and started a lot of conversation, and also have been really big and poignant things for bodies existing in space in and of itself being protest, is the concept of a die-in, which is what you think of, where people lay down and they act as though they have died. And it's a big collective piece. And one of the curious things about it is that a lot of different people from a lot of different races and backgrounds all do this. And that creates a sort of dialogue around who is it that's sacrificing, and what are we sacrificing, and what does it mean? there's been a bit of an art war happening in many cities in terms of murals. People posting a mural and doing this beautiful art, and then other people coming by and destroying that art. And then there's the discussion around what do you do next? Uh, and it's been beautiful to watch people take this destruction of this beautiful artwork and their movement and turn it on its head again and turn it into yet again something beautiful. There's just the Black Lives Matter hashtag as a concept that is this collection of stories. It's a collection of art and media and videos of people putting out there into the world that Black Lives Matter in general, and also just a tool of mobilization. There's the hands up gesture, which has so many different meanings about, and we should definitely link an article in the comments that kind of goes through this, and it's a beautiful piece. But essentially, there's a lot of different ways of taking this one singular movement, even if it is just an image of the innocence of it, of the powerless of it, of the um, willingness to participate in the role, that all of these thoughts come to mind when you see just that image. And that's what makes it so particularly powerful as a piece of protest. There's the kneeling, which we've all seen in various iterations over the last several years. But in the fact that it is still happening today as a movement that represents so much more than the movement in and of itself. And you can just share an image that is just a person kneeling, and that becomes in and of itself a way of visually protesting things. And then you've got some formations that come up in the actual being in the space itself, which I know in terms of Zane and I'm talking more about the digital side, and Zane will be talking about like being in the actual protests. But some things I discovered was an idea of having a lockbox, which is a very particular formation where you're not able to pull people out of it, and they kind of stand as a unit. And there's also this concept of having white bodies on the front line as a way of protection, and protection even with just the idea of privilege. And I see those images online, and it always strikes me as particularly powerful to realize that that's how much power uh, that a white body has versus a black body in this world. And so some remainder images that I've really found to be particularly poignant and powerful over the last few weeks and months have been some of these. This is one of my favorite images online at the moment. If you've been online at all, I'm sure you have seen the Elmo meme in front of the fire and understand that this is tied together as a concept. And I just love that. We've also got this image. And so these are some images that make up the online presence of protests, and you can see in them the bodies and how they are interacting with the space, interacting with each other, interacting with um, the world around them, and how poignant some of these ideas and concepts can be in terms of protest. And so I'm going to hand it over to Zane.
I think just adding to that, one thing that's so powerful is that the dialogue between bodies and space and the actors, right, in the actual protests obviously continues the dialogue through images, right? That those images are causing us to think through power and structures of violence, and that those conversations continue. So my name is Zane McNeil. I am a non-binary trans activist from Appalachia. I created Marks in the Mountains, if any of y'all know about that. It's like an Instagram zine. And I am an activist scholar interested in queer politics and socially engaged art. So I'm going to be talking about two cases today. I'm going to be talking about one that I was in recently that happened in September, led by Queers for Black Lives for the March for Breonna Taylor. And then I'm also going to be talking a little about Black Pride 4, which is a case that happened in 2017 that really just opened my eyes to the power of bodies in space and how like that can create so much tension and conversation and antagonism and how powerful that is. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. All right, so the first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of the way I connect some theories I had learned in college to queer politics. So I was in a socially engaged art class in Maryland when the Black Pride 4 case happened. A little background on that is that about 10 Black trans activists took to the streets of Stonewall Columbus Pride to hold space for murdered Black trans women. And instead of being met with, given space of silence, they were dogpiled, maced by the police, and arrested on trumped up charges. And it kind of illustrates the issues of, you know, gay gentrification, of white supremacy and LGBT movements, of gay capitalism, homo nationalism. And that's what I was very much interested in. And so these different theories, relational aesthetics, and relational antagonism, are the ideas that interactions, whether it be something that's positive or something that is negative, has inherently political implications. And these are art history theories. So these are the concept that tension and kinship is not just political, but that it's also a piece of art. And dialogic art is kind of similar to that. It was coined by an art scholar named Grant Kester. And it's the idea that any kind of dialogue, the dialogue Ray and I are having right now to an extent, could be seen as a form of socially engaged art, which I think is very, very powerful for me because I never really wanted to do object-based art and I never felt like I could be an artist. And so it's through finding the power of the body of dialogue, of community building and collaboration, which I found so empowering as an aesthetic. And so this is an image of the Black Pride 4 movement. The police were actually trained in a style of crowd control by the Israeli Defense Force. And the head of the police department was a white lesbian who was invited to Stonewall Columbus Pride to make sure it was a quote unquote safe space. Stonewall Columbus Pride came out in support of the police in this case. So in queer politics, why I became so invested in that is I did my thesis on the Black Pride 4 with all these socially engaged art theories that were in my head framing my work, even though I mostly worked with resource mobilization, and also political science major. And I was thinking about how powerful it was to put your body, especially as a Black trans person, in a space that antagonistic, right? It gives you an immense amount of power, but also just the precarity of being in that position, right? The violence that these activists face, not just by the police, but by what we would assume to be their larger community with Stonewall Columbus Pride. The supporters of the parade pretty much booed the activists and cheered the police. And I think that says a lot about where we were and where we still have a lot to go in the lesbian and gay movement as being a very white movement, right? And so the quote I have here is by a dance scholar, Susan Felmer, on kind of what chorea politics is. The idea that by engaging in this protest, that is artistic and vice versa, but being artistic or engaging in real political change. You know, being a person engaging in space antagonistically is performative. You know, our biopower is a theory by Foucault, where not only are we impacted by the structures of power around us, but we have the ability to impact it as well. And so by putting your body in a space of tension, you are subverting and challenging, you know, chorea police, the idea of these structures of violence, and that can maybe actually create change just by being on the streets. So one of my favorite scholars, Thomas de France, has argued that Black performance is specifically transformative, that it's a process that matters. When we think of art, we usually think of an object, like I was saying, you think, you know, a sculpture, but the process and the dialogue, and like I was saying, these conversations are really what I find empowering. As you can see, the two white women in the background are cheering when the police are escorting one of the Black trans activists out of the space. And that image went viral. You know, I heard about this case on Teen Vogue. It was pretty well covered. And it continued the dialogue from this into a larger web of issues, because there were similar protests in Minneapolis and Toronto over the same year because of how lesbian and gay movements had really, you know, to an extent sold out for privilege, right? Engaged in try to assimilate into structures of white supremacy, and screw over their most precarious members. And so what de France says is that Black protest, Black performativity is action. It's that it's based on a history of power, of structure, of just change, and that there is something specifically empowering because of a people-driven performance of political choreography, that it's an active tool. So I just wanted to show a little bit about what this looks. The images say a lot already, but to actually see bodies in space and the way they are interacted with, I think really illustrates the theories we're talking about here. So yeah, I think that illustrates exactly what I was saying, right? Just how horrifying that is to watch, but it's important to see the sound, the reactions between what I would consider an audience and the parade goers and the protesters. And something that might help frame that is that not all of the 10 activists who originally stopped the Pride Parade were Black, but only the 4 Black trans people were arrested. And some were arrested on felony charges for quote unquote attacking the police. And even though those ended up being dropped, there's a huge amount of power, obviously, behind that. Next slide, thanks.
That just, I hadn't watched that, partly because I try not to watch those videos. My whole body tensed up. Like,
the trigger warning.
It was intense, but it was important. Like, I think, yeah, it just illustrates the point really well. So
yeah, and that started off a conversation that is still happening, right? It became a huge point in Columbus that continued. People were protesting to try to get the charges dropped. There was a lot of different organizations like the ACLU who came out in support of the Black Pride Corps, and then these conversations are continuing now. The same activists who are there are in the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement. And so just to foreground that, the idea of mobilization of this kind of embodiment of protest really affects how people engage with politics, how people assemble, how people do kind of choreographical movements. Hands up, don't shoot, that is a form of choreography, and it has a lot of meaning and a lot of power in that. Next slide, thanks. So this is another case I was going to be talking about. I was here in September. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and this was hosted by Queers for Black Lives for Breonna Taylor. It was the day after RBG died. And so that's why you see the Make RBG Proud. And what I really love this organization is that it is led by mostly Black women in support of queer Black women in support of Black Lives Matter. And so I just wanted to show a few images of this protest and how it felt when I was in this space as well. Next slide, thanks. So these are some of the activists that were in the space. And I think it's just a very powerful, right? How you perform as a protester. Like, I was in this pre-protest training, and they tell you to wear all Black, to put lots of makeup around your eyes, so it looks people can't tell. They have this technology now that can read your face and remember it, and then police will knock on your doors, right? And so people are doing amazing things to kind of subvert that surveillance state. Next slide. This is the protest. Just being in the streets of Baltimore was so powerful for me. And I mean, for everyone, it feels empowering to just be like, these are our streets. You can't take them. This is what democracy looks like. All the chants that brings the community together and really subverts the norm, the invisibility of violence that happens around the murder of Black and Black trans life every day. So we end up marching, and what's interesting is that I had this whole framework of being in the space with queer politics, with socially engaged art, relational antagonism, dialogic art, and I had that all in mind. And so I was noticing how people reacted to us, right, as an audience. How we were watched by the police helicopter the whole route, working to intimidate us, and just how, it's obviously working if the police get so ticked off at you that they try to intimidate you to such an extent. Next slide. Yeah, so
I think that's your last slide.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of wrap up and just bring down the point that there is such power in our bodies in space, and trying to subvert these structures But there's also a lot of power if you are not able to get out into the streets, right? The dialogue continues through images, through these online communities we have. You know, the pandemic makes it so difficult for so many of us to feel safe being out. But even there's different ways to engage that in this kind of Korea politics that doesn't have to be in the streets. And I'm just so excited to be able to talk to you all about this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zane and Gray. That was really, really enlightening for me about how I might participate in the spaces I navigate. Thank you. And so I want to open it up for questions. And we have one question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think that the different races and backgrounds that participate in die-ins acts as a visual form of attributing to humanness of Black folks? Do you think these acts would be just as powerful if they were done only by Black people?
I think that's a complicated question. I'm not sure. Like, for me personally, I think what makes it particularly powerful is the multiple races that participate in highlighting the different power structures, in that there is a certain amount of loss that happens to white people by choosing to participate in this protest, is that there is a loss there for them too, and that there's no difference between like, if you join, you are considered equally as disposable, for lack of a better way of saying it. I do think there is something powerful about the imagery, particularly with just Black bodies, but in particular, the way that our society is set up at this time, images of that nature, or like movements or moments of that nature, tend to be like less perspectively powerful. I guess that's the best way to say it. Like, I would see them as equally powerful, but it depends on who you are. A great way of looking at this through a like slightly different lens would be, I don't know if y'all remember earlier in the protests where there started to be this dialogue around the moms are coming out. Do you remember this about like several months ago? There's like the moms are on the front line. And ironically, as a Black person, I was like, the moms have always been on the front line. Like, what do you mean? Like, now it's interesting and exciting that like parents are getting involved. Like, what do you think, that Black people haven't been parents and being involved? Or is it that the fact that the soccer moms and the dads with leaf blowers are now involved, that elevates it to a new height? And was it as powerful previously? Yes, but does that add a certain amount of extra power that is of white privilege to be able to do that, and to symbolically give that power away to the protests instead of keeping it for yourself, makes it seem more powerful than what was already previously happening. I don't know. I think it's a good conversation to have, but I think it is reflective of our current systems.
Yeah, when I think of die-ins, I originally think of ACT UP, right? Like, there's a queer history to the die-in as a form of protest during the AIDS epidemic. There's this great dance scholar named Anusha Kedar who wrote in Feminist Wire and the New York Times in 2014 in response to the murders of Michael Brown and Eric Garner, that movement matters and bodies matter, particularly when people are protesting the Black body's disposability at the hands of the state. Choreography, movement, and gesture are not peripheral, but central to the politics of protest. So the Black body is imbued with, I think, more meaning because of how violent our white supremacist state is. So I think it's interesting that there is an inherently queer history to die-ins, but that also there's a lot of different meaning. Like obviously, if I was in a die-in my meeting, my body would mean something else to different people looking at it and engaging with it than a Black trans body.
Thank you for that. We have a related question that I think dovetails nicely. A student asks, artistic concepts are prone to misinterpretation. When using our bodies as art in protests and organizing, how do you think misinterpretation affects the outcome of these protests?
I'll jump on that one first. So choreographic politics is actually kind of a new theory. It's been around since like the 90s. Sorry, my dog, your stuff. It's been around since the 90s, but it's been more popularized since like 2014. It's very intertwined with queer color critique and Black movements specifically, because there is a history of Black movements and performance that you don't see exactly in other social movements. And so it's a little different than if you're like a performance artist, right? That there's a statement you want to make. I feel like protesting in the street is a more obvious statement. I think the bigger issue is that they become misconstrued only as political social movements, right? It's very new to start thinking of politics and social movements as art, as public art. And that's where I've been trying to kind of reframe that, because there's a lot of power in that. I think Anusha Kedar also writes about this, that describing these movements as premeditated, as conscious, as very like understanding resources and engaging as performance, understanding choreography, really challenges how far-right media would portray these uprisings as violent and anarchy and all these racialized and animalistic ways, to try to undermine the power and the need to be in these streets for there to be these uprisings. And I'm pretty sure the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement is one of the largest protests, if not the largest the US has ever had, partly because we actually have time to engage, right? Under capitalism, if you're working full time, you don't have the resources to be out. Being able to do protests, to be an activist can be very privileged. And so in the pandemic, when people weren't working and people were really able to recognize, hey, I can't afford rent, this movement's been going on, pretty much my whole adult life. I'm pissed off, and I can get in the streets for some of the first times in my life. And even though there's this history of Black protest, Black Lives Matter is something new, right? It is different than older Black movements, and it does really center queer and voices and women's voices as well.
So to kind of go off of that, I think a really great example of this is Rosa Parks, actually. So most of my work is historical. So Rosa Parks is at least I grew up in small town Ohio, in Cincinnati, where like our racial demographic and history is very complicated because it's the last city, if you were a slave, you had to cross into to become free. But then people would capture you and take you back over the river. And there was like this huge dialogue between these power structures and these groups of people. So we have some racism, a lot of it. And so in school, when we learned about Rosa Parks, we learned that, she was just a tired older lady who decided to sit down and just wouldn't get up because she was tired. Instead of the fact that Rosa Parks was actually like one person in a line of people who were doing this, and she was an activist throughout her entire life and had been protesting. Like there was so much history that was erased in the retelling of this story, despite the fact that it was meant to be a powerful statement of choice, of intentionality, but since then has been kind of smoothed and softened over. And so I think it is a thing that does happen and does happen often. But I think that's also part of what is so important about um, like learning about the thought patterns and the intentionality behind some of these things, and also maintaining the history of it. Some of it will be in oral history, which is a whole other thing, which I saw that y'all talked about earlier in this series. And some of it will just be in the fact that like you can't always just believe what is the superficiality of what is seen, but really to think about why a person would do this. How does this, is this representative of our dynamics in a larger culture? And you start to realize that the story about Rosa Parks doesn't really make sense when you think about it at the time of like, why this time? Why right now? And it starts to make you question those things and look into it more. So as you are participating, being aware that yes, time may construe your actions to be somewhat different, but that doesn't make them any less powerful. And that people will, sorry, that's my cat's foot. People will like learn that history and understand that in time. And also the easiest way to do it is also to be very clear about it. You know, you can talk about it afterwards, particularly in this age, it's hard to kind of get rid of things. Like as you put something online, it stays online. So you could talk about your actions afterwards so that no one can in the future misconstrue that.
Thank you for that. An anonymous attendee asks, do you think that this retelling of Rosa Parks is specifically whitewashed in a way that gives BIPOC inspiration, but only after they are fully broken down and tired, as you put it?
So I have this book I'm really excited about that I recently read. It's called Raising Racists. I don't remember the rest of the title, but it is about children in the Jim Crow South and how they are essentially indoctrinated into racism and how that functions. And it is through the lens of white children, and it doesn't talk necessarily about the Black experience, which one I found interesting because that's not often covered. But one of the things that was profound about it was the intentionality of changing these stories to like to be the proper history of the South, and things of that nature. And so I don't actually think in a lot of ways it was about Black people. I think it was about, as the book talks about, is supporting and sustaining white male power over Black bodies and over women. And that being like the primary reason for doing this, of like at the time, that was the reason why that was downplayed. Like in my culture, like we've talked about Rosa Parks, and there are lots and lots of jokes and references towards that story of Rosa Parks. So for me, it was contradictory in school to hear, oh, she was just tired and sat down. But then I'd go home and I'd like watch Black television, and they'd be like, why do they keep saying that she just sat down? And you would see very different conversations about this singular moment, which is why I strongly believe it's important to focus on the oral and the written heritage of moments, particularly with Blackness, because one, we're oral culture, and two, the winners write the history books. So you're always going to get a certain lens to certain things like that. But I think it was more to get rid of the guilt and discomfort white people may be feeling, to realize that this woman had been protesting, and many women and many people had been protesting so regularly against this, and it was intentional, versus, oh, she was just tired and that's why she broke the rules. And maybe we really should consider like that Black people should be able to sit anywhere. And then even then it only became a thing that really happened once it became profitable in a lot of ways. Hope that answers your question.
Just to add on to that, I majored in college, my undergraduate, in history because I unlearned all 12 years of my classes beforehand, right? Because I was an intellectual historian, so I was kind of taught how to question everything we've ever been taught and why, like why these narratives are taught to us, how this cult of Americanness, of this kind of silver religion, we internalize it, and that affects our worldview, right? And so I feel like going past probably my whole adult life, I've been trying to unlearn all of the lies, and it's been very, very consciously. These textbooks are usually paid for by more conservative groups. I think there was one textbook that got a lot of heat because they had so whitewashed and the slave trade by saying yeah, these people were choosing to do this. Just ridiculous, right? But there's a lot of power in the way that we learn, right? That's why there's so many great activists, English folks like Berea on pedagogy, right? This kind of Howard Zinn, there's a lot of power in questioning what we've learned and why we've learned that and what power is behind that, what structurally it upholds. And so whenever we hear these narratives that do just eclipse and erase and silence marginalized voices, which I think probably is what the last one was also about, right? With queer voices are obviously so eclipsed and marginalized, especially in rural areas. That's what I think Geringer probably was mentioning. I think that is the first thing we all need to do, is to put the work into reading, Black feminist scholars, reading queer critique, being very critical of my whiteness, of other white people's whiteness, and really recognize that we uphold structures of violence whether or not we want to, and how we can be in the front of these protests if you're able to, because my body obviously offers me a lot more protection than other people's bodies, especially in Baltimore. I've never been in a space where my privilege is so obviously visible, and supported by the police state here. And so how we can use that instead of feeling shame to actually try to act as an accomplice, and to use our bodies to protect those who are more marginalized.
Thank you. And I would add non-Black people of color are also very privileged, non-BIPOC people of color, who also have a responsibility to put their bodies on the front line. I wanted to ask a final question from another one of our attendees. You briefly mentioned the contrast between the civil rights movement of the past and the modern Black Lives Matter protests. Could you elaborate on how the role of bodies in protests have changed over time due to cultural shifts between generations and new technologies like the internet? What ways has there been conscious iteration on previous activist work? Do you think modern protests can study and learn from and emulate the methods of past movements?
Do you want to go, or do you want me to go?
I'm very much focused on contemporary politics and political movements, so I can't speak as much. But I had taken a few courses on social mobilization theory, and there's this political economy theory called resource mobilization, which is very annoying in a lot of ways, but it's really irritating. But it's another way of showing that protest is meditated, right? It's conscionable, really rational actors and whatnot, in a political economicus. And I'd read this text about the civil rights movement from that perspective, right? And so I think it's, again, scholars trying to use these theories that are seen as more privileged and scholarly by white professors to try to validate these movements, right? Instead of being because most social movements would just seem like, oh, why are they out there, But I think queer politics is such a new theory that there hasn't been a lot of historical work done on it. But I think you can use it to frame previous protests, because I think just the theories are more popular than in social movements like resource mobilization. is what people used to try to qualify why this was happening.
So this is kind of my wheelhouse. So there's a lot of different ways you can tackle that question, that series of questions. The primary thing I would focus on is the thought that Black culture doesn't really fetishize the past. Instead, our paradigm is one of continual, not just improvisation, what's the word I'm looking for? Innovation. But the only way to innovate is to know the past. So if you don't understand the past, you can't really innovate. And if you only focus on the past, you can't really innovate. It's since our culture is so focused on being and supporting individual like ideas in and style and support in those ways, like of course the civil rights movement is going to be very different than the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement because they're in different times, they're in different, like there's different things that have happened, there's different ways that have shaped those things. And so one of the clearest ways is like the Panther Party, and the fact that the Panther Party wasn't really a thing and is now becoming a thing again, and that there were specifically groups of people who were Black and who got armed and potentially were using that as a way of not intimidation, but a way of protecting leadership during that time, and use that as a very distinct and intentional way of participating in that movement. And that is a thing that shows up somewhat. It is starting to come back around, but is not particularly as well used. There's also the paradigm of like when you think of the civil rights movement, besides Rosa Parks, you almost always think of Black men, even though one, Black culture is a matriarchy. And so behind those Black men were women who were pushing them to do certain things. But also there, like if you look at the Panther Party again, you see that they were very intentional about who was doing what work. And so the women were out on the front lines and participating in the like visual protesting, while the men were supposed to be in the kitchens cooking the like free breakfast for the neighborhood. And that was an intentional choice that happened. But if you build on that, now you're starting to get women and queer people are actually the visual representation of the movement instead of just like a portion of turning it on its head. It's now being led by these other people instead of just this like, oh, of course it's the Black guys that are doing this. And I think that's really distinctly innovative and distinctly powerful of a change here that's been happening. And so a lot of other things that I can't really get into because I think we're short on time is that there's a mindset difference also that I think is partly because of the internet. Because of the internet, there is a lot of more communication between people. Being post-civil rights, we have a very different outlook of what we deserve and what we don't deserve and how to get those things. People are much more outspoken than older generations whom, if you were to do certain things during prior to the civil rights era, there was a high possibility that you would be lynched, and that changes what you are willing to do and how you're willing to act and put things out there. And so a piece I was just writing somewhat recently was about the history of lynching and how it affects people. And one of the important aspects is the fact that, so for me, I'm pretty young, and my mother was born right after the civil rights era. Jim Crow really stopped basically around the civil rights era. Like one of the last lynchings that was publicly acknowledged was during that time. That's besides the fact that like it's still happening today, clearly. Did you notice? And the thought is like, well, who raised my mother? The people who raised my mother were people who had grown up in the Jim Crow era. So there are certain things that were passed on for safety, that were passed on for the role that you're supposed to play in society, that she inherited, whether or not she actually grew up during the Jim Crow South. And so then that was passed on to me, and there's certain aspects of that that I carry with me, but we're so removed from that now that my generation is the one that's starting to be able to look at it and be like, okay, that wasn't okay. And also, I'm not willing to play the game to be able to live my life and to be able to exist and to be able to be proud and to be able to do these things and to celebrate myself as myself. And that is just something that is, again, innovative. And also, I think by having the support of the internet and being able to like record these things and post them and talk about them and discuss and mobilize in such a fashion that is outside of the Black church also, I think is important. That makes this movement distinctly very different from the civil rights movement of the 60s.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this really generative conversation. I'm so grateful to you both, and Berea College has so much to learn from you both. So thank you. And thank you to our audience. And we hope to see you on November 12th at our Gender Talk. Thank you, everyone. Bye.